Okay, good morning. Again, my name is Rob Stein, and I am the Deputy Director of the Dallas Museum of Art. Thank you for having me today. I think you can hear me all right. It sounds like I'm booming. I don't need to talk quite so loud, maybe. So, Nancy and Ilaria asked if I would come and tell you a little bit about a project that we've been working on together with many colleagues, some of you in the room, regarding how mobile content might be shared and kept alive across many different kinds of technology cycles, and how would you do that? And so in 2008, actually, Nancy and I held the first sort of meeting in London at the Tate. I think, Glenn, you were there. And to begin to discuss what specifications for content modeling in mobile tours might look like. And Nancy and Ilaria were just talking about this, but when we can decide together as a group what we should call things, as simple as that sounds, it's actually very difficult. And it's very important, and it's really the very first step at creating standards. Now, I'm not proposing that TourML, which I'll talk to you about, is necessarily a standard yet, but it's definitely a specification that works for sharing content between a variety of mobile platforms. In my opinion, that's the first step to being a standard, and then once everybody uses it, then it's a standard. So let me tell you a little bit about TourML and TAP. Again, why do we want to care about data portability at all? This is a fairly simple question, but one that's really important. And you may not think necessarily that your content needs to be portable between applications, but in fact, many of us have seen this road already. So I wonder if anyone's ever had content in a current application that you'd like to use in the next version of technology. Perhaps many of you have, almost a decade ago, worked at a variety of kiosk apps. I know that in the States, museums in the early 2000s and the 90s were deploying a bunch of content, much of which is still very good and applicable today, inside of kiosks that would go in the galleries of the museum or in a variety of places. And in fact, this is an application that I created for which the content is still very good, but the way in which I built it means that I can't take that same content and use it on my mobile device today. Of course, we didn't really know in the 90s or early 2000s about what smartphones would be like, and the fact that everyone would have them in their pocket, and the fact that we would actually want to use them inside of a museum or gallery. We didn't know this. But one of the things we can begin to predict is that we will constantly be in a state of not knowing what we'll want to do with technology another 10 years from now. All that we do know is the stories we're telling about our heritage today will be similar stories that we'll want to tell in the future, and the work that we've done to bring them together and create the stories, especially for the very good ones, is work that we'll want to keep. We don't want to have to continually retell stories in a new way all the time. We'll do that, and we'd like to have technology work for us. So the real question is, how do we unlock the content that we already have? Are there easy ways to do that? How can we perhaps share or reuse content either between organizations or indeed inside of our own organizations across multiple cycles in technology? So many of you are familiar with other content standards and specifications. Of course, Dublin Core schema.org is a relatively new one, formed mostly by Google and Microsoft, along with many others, but has started to gain some traction for content modeling on the web. Lido and EPUB being perhaps the most used standard for, or the most well-known standard for publishing of electronic content in book form. TourML, you'll hear me switch back and forth. TourML is the Tour markup language, so like HTML is a hypertext markup language. We also call it turmoil, which in English is a word that means much struggle and difficulty. We hope it's not actually turmoil, but that's what we call it. We talked to you a little bit about the history of TourML, and again, it started in 2008 with a discussion at the Tate Mobile Workshop or Summit, and with a small group, I think maybe 25 or 30 folks. We followed up with another 2 mobile summits. Again, this is a version of that, I think. But all in all, I would say there were maybe 150 to 200 museum professionals who really spoke into a lot of what is built or codified into this TourML specification now. So there were lots of people who had their opinions influencing the way that this document standard works today. So we'll tell you a little bit about what that is. We had a couple of basic rules that we set out to cover when we created TourML, because we really wanted it to be a standard or a specification that could be used both by the not-for-profit community and the for-profit community, and one that would equally allow museums to share their content freely, but also for corporations to develop proprietary products. This area of mobile content in museums is one where there's a really rich dialogue between the commercial vendors and the museums themselves. And actually, because of how quickly mobile technology changes, that vendor relationship is extremely important. So we had a rule with TourML that we really wanted to see TourML hitting this 80% mark. So we don't anticipate that TourML will be able to model 100% of everything that you would want to do with mobile in museums. We think that shooting for a description of 80% of the most common things that we share across our mobile apps is the right place to start. So we focused on really trying to model those most common attributes of mobile tours, and then providing a way to extend or enhance TourML for the other 20%, so that it may be the case that a mobile vendor will support the TourML standard for getting content in and out of their platform, and then innovate a 20% of their unique solutions on top of that. They may be extensions to this core schema, and those 20% we will at some point in time wrap into the schema if they also become things that are common. So we tried to standardize around a simple core and build a way to extend it in the future. So TourML, what it is and what it is not. We focused really strictly on TourML as a content modeling schema. So it's meant to describe the stories that you want to tell in a mobile tour, and the connections between multimedia and media of various forms together with each other, knowing that the majority of the way that we experience mobile content for museums is in chunks that are connected together. So both the content itself and its connections to each other, the semantics and the relationship between order, the order in which you're allowed to experience content by the tour designer, those are all contained and described by the TourML standard. We do not model the presentation layer of a mobile tour. So we do not describe where the button is located on the screen. We do not describe elements of graphic design. We do not describe the animations that occur between phases of an app. Those are all elements of the presentation, and they may in fact change depending on the devices that you go to. So the vision is that you could model the content of a story on one device, say a kiosk, and then lift the content and its connections out and redeploy this on a mobile phone. Now you may use different kinds of techniques for interacting with it on a phone than you would on a kiosk, and that's why we don't talk about presentation modeling. Okay? Okay. I should say that we have had some generous support and funding from the United States federal agency called the Institute for Museum and Library Service. We had a 2-year grant from them that was a national leadership grant that envisioned the partnership between a number of US institutions around the further development of the TourML standard and around an open source implementation of a mobile platform called TAP. We'll talk about TAP in a moment, but the important part is that we wanted to develop both the standard itself and the software that implemented that specification so that anyone who would want to implement it with their own tool would have an example to start from. So TAP is that open source example and implementation. It's, again, admittedly fairly simple. Right now it sticks to about that 80% and takes some work and some software developer knowledge to get started. I know a number of places. I'll show you some examples of places that have used TAP both as its own standalone solution and ways have used pieces and parts of it as integrated into a variety of proprietary solutions. So let me tell you a little bit about the elements of the TourML schema. When I say schema, TourML is at its essence for the developers and in the room, it's an XML schema that is able to be validated according to those rules and is designed and distributed as a schema document. When you create a tour, an actual piece of content, you're creating an instance of that schema, which can then be interpreted with all of the standard sets of tools. So in that XML schema for TourML, there are a number of elements, and those elements are seen here on the screen. We're going to describe all of them to you, but you can see a little bit of the hierarchy here. There are tours themselves, which are considered an experience, a self-contained experience. And then tour sets tell you that there may be more than one of these tours that you carry around on a device with you. And we'll talk about that in a second. So let's start from the very lowest level and work our way up to the top. So we had to agree on what we would call these variety of media, images, video, audio, objects from your collections, web pages that exist online already, locations, bodies of text, and several other things, but these are the most common, what we call assets. This is a word that many of you may already use in your tours, but assets are multimedia content that belong to the tour. This may include elements of your presentation even. So a logo for your tour is an image that could be considered an asset. The image of Sant'Apollonia and the frescoes behind me would be an asset in your tour. The audio of my talk this morning or the video that would also be assets in a tour of the Mobile Summit in Florence in February. So those are assets. We then spent quite a bit of time debating about what we would call this, but a stop on a tour. We would think of like you're riding a bus, and the bus takes a number of stops, and each time it stops, you can get off the bus and see something interesting. So likewise, on a tour, there are many occasions where you will you'll have an opportunity to present content to your user. We call that a stop, and a stop is essentially a collection of assets together. So where you have maybe a slideshow of images and an audio soundtrack and an order that those images are to be experienced in, that is one stop. So our definition of a stop is that it's a collection of assets that were designed to be experienced together. So a stop only needs to have at least one asset, but it can have many. It can have many all at the same time. Does that make sense? Because that was one that we had a bunch of discussion about, because many implementations call this something different. This seems to be the most common phrase used to describe this idea.
It's important maybe to just dwell on this for a moment, because the TourML usage is slightly different from what a lot of audio tour providers do. So just ask again if there are any questions on this.
Nancy is noting that the way that TourML uses the word stop is different than the way many mobile audio tour providers have used that word in the past, or the way in which you may currently think about presenting your assets together. Nancy has also had, you will often talk about soundtracks and sound bites, right? So a soundtrack to a movie is the audio that goes along with you in the movie, and you can imagine wandering through a space and having audio that plays with you the entire time, but then you may want to pause and interact with your tool in some way. Those would, in the TourML usage, those would both be stops, but you may experience them at different times. Is this okay? Yes, I'm seeing heads nodding up and down. I have a question in the middle.
For example, we used TourML since 2 years, for 2 years.
Yes?
In France, for a big platform to be built with TourML, you use TourML for interactive table, for example, and it's a free, so each point is a stop for us.
Yes?
And we use TourML for mobile apps, for interactive table, and all multimedia projects. The stops could be only a point in a tree, for example.
Yes, right. His comment was that in France they use TourML to model the content experiences on interactive tables, and he's pointing out what I will show you in a moment, that a stop and assets are elements of a tree, a structure like a tree, and so the way that you're using it, which is very correct, is not as a linear story, but is one that can have many directions on top of a touch table.
And the project is to use connection to do transmedia projects between mobile applications and interactive tables on board. Use connection into TourML.
Oh, perfect. Well, maybe you'll tell us more about that tonight. So, okay, so this is very important. So in TourML, another one of those elements in the schema is called a connection. And a connection is simply the relationship between stops. So remember, a stop is a collection of assets that is designed to be experienced together at the same time. And connections are the order and context that you have between those stops. So if you want to think about this as you're designing a tour for your user, you may have in mind a certain set of choices that they're allowed to make at any one point in time. Those choices can be modeled as connections in TourML. So for a slideshow, you may only have one choice, to stay where you are or to go to the next image. That is, can be seen as a connection. Or if you're telling a story for which the user is a choose your own adventure. The user has a number of choices. They could go to the left, to the right, or to the center. Those are all connections between stops in the TourML sort of specification. Okay? So it's how stops relate to one another and expresses the flow of your story. Yes, sir?
So stops are only, connections are only between stops, not between axes. If you want to build something between axes, you need a layer of stops above that.
Correct. So he's pointing out that the connections only relate between two stops. And if you'd like to connect one asset to the next, you need to contain them inside of a stop. That's correct. And I'll show you pictures of this in a second that will maybe make it a little bit clearer too. That's right. So this is, actually these diagrams come right out of tools that allow you to design XML schemas. And so they are technically correct, but this is in fact what it would look like. So a stop has a reference to an asset. So the dotted arrow is technically a reference to an element inside of a stop. So a stop must have at least one asset. And stops can be connected to each other. So the horizontal arrow between those two stops is a connection. So this may be the case if you have two audio files that are meant to be experienced one right after the other. This is what your TourML instance would look like to do that. Of course, you might get more complicated. And actually, I told you a little lie earlier. Stops do not need to have one asset. They can have 0 assets. So the instance here at the very top of the screen, this is a stop which you may think of like a menu screen. So the menu screen you may have at the very beginning of your tour doesn't technically have any content to it. It simply is a place for users to choose which path they would like to go along. So this is an example of that. So in this first instance, you may come into the tour in one of two places, and you could either take a very short tour, which only experiences these assets at the bottom, or you may have 3 separate paths to go along. And these, as you can imagine, these graphs can get very complicated, very extensive, the more content that you add in, but this is an idea that shows you a few things. So stops can connect to other stops. You can have chains of these things together, and you can share assets. So notice the second asset from the left at the bottom is pointed to by more than one stop. That means that you can reuse the same, let's say the same image in more than one place, or the same set of background audio. Maybe you have the same audio that plays through all of your stops. That can just be one file that's used from many different connections. Okay? Okay. And then the important part is that you may have a number of these on a single device at the same time. So in our museum in Indianapolis, we would create tours for permanent collection galleries in the museum, but we may have one tour for our Asian collection and another tour for our American collection and a third tour for our African collection. They could be created at a variety of different times. We may want to replace or update them differently. And so on a single device, they would stand alone as unique tours. They could be bundled together as the Indianapolis Museum of Art Permanent Collection tour set, right? And so they're bundled like this. Now, tour sets can technically be bundled and distributed. The way that we would do this when you produce a TourML schema instance, so it looks like a text file. It's described in XML, and it comes with a directory full of images, audio, video, and other text. All of this can be zipped up together in a single file and distributed across networks or emailed very simply. There are many places that can do this. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston was maybe the first place to widely deploy TourML across their museum, and they actually will do updates of tour content across the network. So I think they have nearly 800 iPod Touch devices that all sit on their network, and they will push updates of tour sets to those iPod Touch devices nightly as they change the content. So this is how they were using that for mobile tours in their permanent collection. Yeah, Glenn.
Are they just using deltas there, or are they like the whole tour again? Is something to speak about?
Yeah, I don't actually know the way that they're doing it. They wrote some particular software that is used on their network. So Glenn's question was, are they redeploying the whole tour every time they change, or are they only updating the changes? So I guess, I mean, it would be fairly simple, and maybe you've done this, Glenn, but if you simply replaced the schema document, because that's just a text file, that's very easy to upload and replace, and then only upload the assets that have changed, that would be a much more efficient way of doing it. Okay. So we have developed and are in development with a set of validation tools. There's a website called TourML.org, as well as its mirror called tapintomuseums.org. And there you'll be able to find tools that will help to validate the TourML schema. So why is this important? Let's say that you have your own software that you've spent many years developing as a way to allow users to tell stories, and what you'd like to do is export that content as a TourML document. We have some software we can provide to you as a reference for how we create TourML documents, and we have the complete schema. But when you do this, when you implement it into your tool, you'd like to be able to test it to make sure that it would work with somebody else's tool. So if I was creating a word processing software, I would want to save as a PDF. And so I want to make sure that other people can read my PDF. Well, you can, in this case, we would provide software that will test the TourML document that you would write from your software to make sure that it adheres to the schema and is ordered in the correct way, and that somebody else's software could make use of it. And vice versa. If you were to write software that reads TourML content from somebody else's application, you'd like to know that when you wrote this reader that it is doing everything correctly. So there are sample instances that you can access there with content that you would be able to pull in and test. Again, the TourML specification was a partnership between many different people. We led some of that from the Indianapolis Museum of Art, but we wanted to make sure that there was a diverse representation of stakeholders. And so we created a steering committee for the TourML specification. And this steering committee has the responsibility for caring for that specification and adding pieces to it. Again, we've only focused on 80% of the most common things, and we've given you a highlight of it here today. But this committee is made up of folks both in the nonprofit space, software developers and non-technical content developers, as well as mobile tour vendors and folks running companies that are invested in seeing this specification stay around for a while and not go into crazy places. So the steering committee meets informally a few times a year to discuss the new things that are happening with TourML. As many of these folks are users of the specification, so in their experience, if they've discovered it would really be better if it did it this way and as opposed to the way it currently does, then this is the committee that would adopt changes. Okay, so for more information, these are a few websites. I'll make sure to post these slides on SlideShare later as well. My SlideShare account is my name, RJ, Stein. And you could also go to just tapintomuseums.org. I wanted to show you a little bit of what TAP looks like. So this was our very first TAP tour. TAP, again, is the open source implementation on top of the TourML specification. So it is fairly simply designed in its basic case to have a screen where you dial some numbers, and that will take you to a stop, which will display a few assets. That's in essence what TAP does. We can theme it in a few different ways, and we've seen that it's been used by a number of different places around the world. The Gemeentemuseum in The Hague has developed a very similar app on top of this. The center were a set of students from a university in North Dakota in the States. The top right is the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. We mentioned them already. On the bottom, on the left, is an application written on an iPad. So this is one that developed a set of new code but used TourML to model the content inside of it. So this is, they used elements of TAP, but then they changed a lot of the software. The Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art was the first one that really used TourML inside of a commercial platform. So this is proprietary software to drive the tour and the TourML specification for all of the content modeling there. You know, I think it was a one-off. It was a web platform, and I think it's one of these where you work with the company and you use their platform, but I don't think they market it. And then the last was an app with the Smithsonian Museum of Native Americans. A few more extensions. The Indianapolis Museum of Art used TAP and TourML to model a timeline tour around the artist Ai Weiwei for an exhibition in Indianapolis. And the Art Institute of Chicago developed a really sophisticated set of gallery interactives, essentially kiosks, which used their own software and extensions of the TourML specification. And they did that specifically because they knew that the content, their gallery content, specifically around porcelain, was content that did not change as quickly as technology changed. So that's why they did that. Again, this is the Tap Into Museums website. There are many case studies there, as well as links to the specification and the schemas. And so again, the difference between TourML and TAP is that TourML is just a description of the content model. It could be used across many different platforms, both open and proprietary, and you could use it in only small pieces, or you could change it, as our colleagues in France did, for a different application altogether. TAP is the open source reference implementation on top of TourML. So many people may use TAP out of the box if their content needs are very simple. Vendors are using TAP so that their software developers can look at code that works and take elements out of that and use it to accelerate how quickly they can implement support in their own platform. Yes? So TAP supports, there is a native iOS application. I believe there's not an Android application that's distributed with TAP at this point. There are some members of the community who have an Android version, and then the most common use is a mobile web application. So Ilaria and Nancy and myself and Susan brainstormed just a few questions that we'd love. I've spent quite a while talking, but I'd love to just know from the group, just open discussion, but one, do you think that TourML fits a need that you currently see, either for your own purposes or for your clients? We had intended to make it very easy to adopt or integrate TourML, so I wonder if you think it's easy, because it doesn't matter if I think it's easy. Is there anything from your perspective we could do that would make adopting TourML easier for you? We would love to see that happen. And then are there any specific reasons that maybe we haven't thought of that would prevent you from using TourML? And I see a hand in the back.
My question is, do you have kind of editing software that you can...
Hold on, just one second. We're going to do a lot of cuts, so this can all...
No, I'm editing from the Netherlands. Does it work? I'm sorry. I'm editing from the Netherlands. I was wondering if you have kind of editing software that you can use to see what you're doing, because when you describe it now, it's that you are actually writing code, right? But usually editors don't see what you're doing.
Right. So the question for the room, thank you, was whether or not there was editing software that you could use so that as you're developing the tour, you can see what you're doing. So again, this is where the difference between TourML and TAP comes in. TourML is just the XML schema that describes content models. TAP does have a content editing interface. So TAP is built on top of the Drupal content management system. And so it's very easy to create web content using Drupal, and the extensions to TAP will allow Drupal to write out a valid TourML document. So essentially you're authoring a website that just gets packaged in a particular way. But that's the TAP side. Most vendors will have a way to author their tour content, and many of them are much more sophisticated than the TAP software is. It was a very good question. Yes, follow up.
Another question. Again, my organization has a very international audience, public, so we usually publish in 6 languages. So I always look at these types of software. How can we deal with multi-language versions?
That's a great question. That was a part of the TourML specification that I had not covered, but it does have multilingual support built into TourML. So you have the ability for stops and assets to define both the titles, text, and metadata in more than one language, as well as more than one version of assets per language. So you may think of an image that has text embedded in the image. So you may assign an image to multiple languages. So the TourML specification does support this, and there are a number of places that have used it. The Gemeente Museum in particular was the first to use this in Dutch and in English, I believe. And then on the authoring side, the Drupal content management system has very robust multilingual authoring tools, and we just leverage that.
I was thinking I might just add, Rob, to really answer the first question. Obviously, we have a mix here of mobile providers to museums and museum professionals who work with mobile in the room. So, please kind of rephrase these to speak to your audiences, your visitors, if that's more appropriate. But I thought I would just share one kind of case study of my experience of needing TourML. And I know you've also implemented it as well. So I wanted to get you perhaps to add your experience in your projects in France. So I had a very interesting, as you can see, I've been kind of part of wanting to promulgate this standard from the very beginning, and found myself in an interesting situation when I was working with the Smithsonian, where we had a mobile tour created for a traveling exhibition, and it was going to a venue which already had a mobile tour app created on a proprietary platform by one of the industry vendors. And so rather than having a second app that was developed on a second platform, they asked if we could simply put the tour into their existing app, which was obviously very efficient in terms of device distribution and content management. And it was a very short tour. It was only 20 stops. And I kind of thought, wow, this is the perfect case for using TourML. You need to port the content from one proprietary platform to another. But because neither of the vendors had yet built the kind of APIs, I guess, for the transferring the content across, and because the tour was only 20 stops, we thought, this time we're just going to manually port it across. And I had a volunteer who was working with us who offered to do this work. We thought it would take a day, maybe 2 days. It took the better part of 3 weeks, because the volunteer had to learn 2 different platforms, and each one had its own peculiarities. Although, and I think quite rightly, both of the vendors would have said they were very easy, WYSIWYG platforms, authoring tools to use. And so it was a real lesson in kind of false economies, where I wish I had insisted, and in fact it was part of the contracts with the vendors, that they should support TourML. And I think it would have been interesting to have actually gone back and built, those connections, and then tried the same thing using TourML to compare it in terms of the amount of time that it took to just manually copy and paste from one platform to another. I still almost can't believe it to this day that it turned out to be such a cumbersome process. But you can imagine if that's the case on such a small scale, when we start talking about porting to next generation devices, or you start talking about large museum collections, think about museums that have 1,500 stops of content in 8 or more languages, and there are many already like this. Just what kind of time and efficiency, time can be saved and efficiency can be added to the system by being able to move. At least, our goal again is to be able to move at least 80% of the content across directly. There probably will always be a need to go in and manually kind of tweak things, deal with the sort of the content that doesn't fit within the defined TourML schema, but still the bulk of the work would be done immediately. So that's just kind of my own little testimony.
Paolo and Glenn. Paolo.
I'm Paolo Paolini from Italy. We have an application generating something equivalent, so I think we can integrate very easily, but also getting Nancy's comments. We would like to, the success of HTML was made by the browser, not by the language. They said Netscape, and then whatever came, Mosaic, whatever. So I think the adoption of TourML needs a universal browser, universal reader. Anyway, if you have your specific app, I write in TourML, I have to rewrite for that app. So I think we should, it's a great idea, but we should develop a universal app so I can go to Smithsonian, deliver my tour. Otherwise, why should I I can generate a TourML version of our content. Mm-hmm. But what for, if I am the only one that can read it? So I think that we should, it's interesting to create a movement for a universal reader, universal tour browser somehow. So I'm sure that I generate TourML, anyone can read it. Otherwise, we will not go.
Yeah.
So I think more than authoring, the real issue is universal browsers, universal readers of TourML content.
So a universal browser. So maybe a Chrome plugin.
Almost universal browser. And we know we have a number of browsers, but more or less you can safely write HTML and you know that people are going to read it. So if I write TourML content, who's going to read it? I think
That would be a great validator, right? Instead of a boring validator. Glenn has a question or comment.
Comments. I wouldn't like to see a universal app because that'll put us out of business. But in saying that, I think that the biggest issue facing that is not a technology question, it's a content licensing issue. I mean, I'd like to see any museums in that publish their tours as TourML under an open license, so that people who are aggregating that, and there's a ton of them will be doing it at some point as well, that are aggregating tours from around the world, can actually publish them and get them to a wider audience. I mean, it's a different thing. But we've talked with several customers about using this, and it's come down to we should do that because they want to develop stuff in their own content management systems or their own asset management systems, and they want to have a My Tours app. So talking to things like Museums Victoria and stuff, and we want to do that at some point, but it's coming down to kind of budgets at the moment. And with someone like Auckland Museum at the moment are just putting all of their content behind an API and trying to encourage them that we maybe put TourML as an endpoint to that API, so that it's going to make it incredibly easier for us if a collection object is as a stop or whatever is just represented in that one format. Then we don't need to write a million connectors to each individual museum.
Right.
So it's hard, but it comes down to budget.
So it is interesting. There isn't a widely held urgency among the museum clients for why they would want this, and it could be that they've not hit this wall yet, perhaps, but
they haven't. I mean, Auckland Museum has, and that's why they see it's interesting. And Museums Victoria know that it's a problem having these siloed pieces of content. So it is interesting to people. It's just whether we can get the budgets to build these tools.
Right. So there was a comment in the back here. While you're passing the microphone, I will say that when I came to Dallas, Dallas was a very early adopter of mobile web content. So as early as 2007, they had mobile web content for their permanent collection. It was produced from an Oracle content management system and published directly to the web. We had about 200 stops worth of content for the permanent collection, and Oracle already publishes in an XML document for this purpose. So we wrote one XSL schema translation, so one document, and we're able to translate all of the existing content into the TourML schema. And I think it took us 3 or 4 hours. But yes, sir, question.
Okay, I'm David Rogai, and I'm from Florence, a company that develops mobile guides for museums nearby. And I was just thinking about the questions, and the first one, absolutely yes, because our clients needs now more than before to be independent in editing and enhancing their content and updating. So the CMS and the algorithm tool question just covered that part. Another part is that I see now that TourML is very simple about relation and connection. About clients' features like viewer, special viewer, I see the terms object is something that, and most important is the interaction among assets. For example, we do augmented reality experience in our guides, and you know that there is a special viewer and there is relation among content and connection. So do you cover also how some assets can automate function together among them?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So let's see if I understand correctly. you have certain apps, for instance, augmented reality, for which the assets in the space will react to the user and maybe will initiate another asset. Is that right?
That's a simple use case.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm thinking about.
Mm-hmm. We've talked about a variety of things, particularly this case of it's like an automated chain of events that happens based on a user's action, right? We've thought about extending TourML to support various kinds of embedded scripts and or adding timing elements to stops, right? So you could model that very simply in TourML as a set of stops that automatically chain together. And then the relationship between how some assets, the notion of a play, action on an asset makes sense, and other times it doesn't. Really, we felt like this was outside of our 80%, and it was actually a good area for vendors to be able to innovate inside of. So the way that you may do this for your app is special and unique to the service that you can offer to your clients. And so what might be more important, if you think of, we don't know what the next generation after smartphones is going to look like. Now maybe it's the Google Glass that Neil is wearing here. So would be great for an augmented reality app, right? But we don't know that yet. When we get there, the content that you've created today for your clients, if minimally, you could take the package of those raw assets and carry it over to a new platform. And if the only thing you had to do at that point was reconstruct the interaction between assets, that's at least better than having to start over from scratch. So that's where we started. Now, I think there have been a number of individuals who've taken the core schema in TourML and modified it in places or added elements to that schema that would support their own proprietary interactions. And there are legal ways to do that would make the instance of XML still validate in other platforms. Because in essence, the software would see an element that it doesn't recognize and would ignore it. But it would find as long as you don't change the existing elements, adding new attributes to an element won't break anything.
Okay, thank you. I was just saying because I has been in ISO and MPEG 21 standardization process. So that's
Yes.
I was thinking about how can you manage that
Yes.
variety of things. Thank you for the answer.
Thank you. And this is why I try to call it more of a specification, because those are incredibly rigorous standardization processes, and this is not there yet.
My name is Alan Wecker. I'm from the University of Haifa and University of Trento. We had a project last year where we converted our present application from the museum, the Hecht Museum, from a proprietary web application to a TourML application. In the end, we had to generate two types of TourML files, one so that it would be able to run on tap, and one to run on the modified original web application. And things that would help, I guess, one would be hierarchical content. In other words, we have like 40 stops, and then we want to put all those stops and data in one TourML file, and then maybe build on that individual tours that take data from reference from that one major file. And that didn't, in other words, it works in our application, but didn't work in the TAP.
I see.
So that was one.
So TourML supports the hierarchy, but we didn't have a player that would show that to you.
Right. In other
Okay.
words, they hadn't thought of that when talking
Yeah.
with Kyle and that, hadn't
Right.
thought of that sort of usage. And the other thing that's very connected for us is navigation. In other words, how to get from one stop to another stop, and because you already have those connections there,
Right.
and to repeat that data for physical navigation is a sort of waste which we have to do in order to get the navigation. And the third item, I guess, is extensions. In other words, you want to plan a tour maybe before a user and have that, and then maybe also record what he actually did. And maybe, something like a visit ML that references the TourML information, says which things did he see, which stops did he go, which assets did he play, which assets did he not play. And that could be used, by other museums to say, okay, this is his interests, these are the things he likes.
Yes,
You
right.
maybe recommend him the next tour where he goes.
Right. No, that's an interesting idea. So essentially the click stream of your tour. So we've talked a lot in museum mobile content space in general about context, user context. We felt like that was different than content modeling in TourML, but you used the word, you coined visit ML, so maybe that's a new thing, but it is great, and many of you may already do this, but you may have a way to track the context of your users and which content they've seen or not seen, but you're correct that
We developed a visit ML.
You did?
We said that, references the TourML elements, and use it to personalize
Yeah.
second visitors.
That would actually be really useful if you wouldn't mind. There is a mailing list for the TourML group. And a lot of folks will subscribe to that, but I think many of them would be interested in Visit ML. Maybe you could send an email to that list for us. That would be great. I think we have a comment.
Rob, you're talking about a kind of single organization-centric point of view in dealing with assets. Tomorrow we'll be talking about storytelling and smart cities, and that is multiple contributors, multiple asset owners, and to make it even worse, is social media environments. We have had the question about editing environments, but this is more. We're looking for a collaborative environment with different ownership being tourism offices, being SMEs, being cruise ship operators, being open data, open culture input.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that from your point of view?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Thank you. So I think it was Glenn that first raised the issue about content licensing. One of the things that I didn't mention is that the TourML schema is available under an open source license, but then it's up to the individual content creator to license the nodes of their content, right? Because the TourML instance is simply an XML file paired with a variety of media assets. It does work very well in a web environment to serve both the schema instance and the assets through regular web servers. But to date, I'm not aware of anyone who has really federated content from more than one provider. Theoretically, it would be very easy to create a search index of open content providers described in TourML. So one of the things, it's not enough for me to just put audio files out on a web server, right? You have to add metadata to them. Depending on the usage, TourML may not be the best describer for that. Some of the standards and schemas earlier in the document, Dublin Core and EPUB and Lido and others, may turn out to be better ways to describe the metadata, depending on how you want to use it. But if there were contributed cultural tours, we've had a number of places who are interested in tourism, content about tourism and the places you would be driving, so that if you were, the Minnesota History Center did a driving tour based on TourML that used the GPS on your phone, and as GPS was how you triggered assets to play. And so you can imagine if you had a set of organizations that would provide that sort of content, that federating it would be really useful. I'm not aware of anyone that's done that to date.
Good and bad to know.
Good and bad to know. Maybe somebody in the room wants to do that. You can have our content from Dallas if you want that.
You're up right now?
Sure.
For technical, I have 19% of the apps use offline data because networks, connection problems, and foreigners. To build an app, it's necessary to download descriptions on assets. Why not TourML? It's answer the first question. I have two examples of using TourML. For example, we made an app for Versailles Palace, and if you can create your own tour and share on the social networks. Everyone can create assets, and we send the TourML in digital asset management, and all friends, when they connect, download TourML and have the tours of their friends, for example. And we have a lot of TourML in our digital asset management. Another example is we made a tour in the train. You can discover by the windows of the train the castles, and there is a TourML in all the tour. And we can download other tours to visit castles when you are in the site, for example. We can connect TourML between the tower in the train and the tower in the castle, for example, using TourML, for example. Mm-hmm. We use Fedora Commons like digital asset management to manage all data, and we have APIs to connect with an engine who can create TourML for all tours.
Yeah. That's really interesting. The train example is one that is a really good idea, and you could imagine what the story model would look like, right? I should mention that one of the things that TourML does allow that may help with federating content from different places is that it does allow you to reference other schemas. So for example, when we build a permanent collection tour, many of those objects are described in Lido or CDOC CRM or CDWA or another common metadata standard around, for us, works of art. We have an instance or an element in TourML that's essentially a metadata wrapper around that object schema. That just says, okay, here's the object in a different format. You can interpret it according to these rules, and then it adds a layer of metadata for how that object is to be used inside of the tour, because that of course is not necessarily supported in those other standards. They were meant for a descriptive purpose, and we want to use the object in a narrative framework. So that's a way that, I don't think anyone has done this for the Europeana data model, but you could imagine creating a similar wrapper around the Europeana data model, and then as you publish tours, and maybe it's Vincent, yes? Yeah, maybe this is what Vincent is talking about, in that you could allow users to bundle these discrete pieces of content together to tell their stories, in which case TourML is the story framework, but the Europeana data model is describing assets that have been digitized and federated over a much larger scale.
We might want to take that offline. I'm meeting with Deputy Director of Europeana next week in The Hague.
Cool.
So we might connect.
Yeah, no, I think it would be very good, very good.
So, just so we don't we started a little bit late, but just so we don't run too far behind, and we don't want to take any time away from the kind of coffee breaks and the lunch, which I think are going to be really important times for a conversation in a less formal setting and for just general networking. So I think what we're going to do is go ahead and move on, if it's okay, Susan, to talk a little bit about the book sprint. But if you still have questions or thoughts or things occur to you about TourML and standards in general throughout the day, don't let them go. Keep note of them and grab one of us, or we can continue the conversation via email, and as Rob mentioned, the TourML listserv as well would be a great thing. And one of the things that I'm kind of putting a little bit on the back burner just in considerations for time is the discussion about standards and really ways of tagging content for accessibility. So if anybody has a particular interest in that, please do grab me. So that's a conversation we can kind of develop going forward. Thank you, Rob. So as I mentioned earlier, Susan Chun is Museums in the Web's publisher, and she's also a Chief Content Officer at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and is going to share an idea that she kind of presented with me, and I thought it sounded brilliant, and we hope you will like it as well.
Okay, so can you guys hear me?